couple of weeks ago, I was at the AFP, Americans for Prosperity Convention, and they had a few more people than we did here. But let me tell you that when James, the Patriot Act Sensenbrenner, got up and the crowd cheered more than for any other speaker, that let me know that we need the campaign for liberty. He is wrong about our Constitution. He's wrong about our foreign wars. And the Republicans, like him, are as much a part of the problem as are the Democrats, who are determined to destroy us now. They might not think so, but the warfare part of the warfare state will consume our resources and take away our liberties just as surely as the welfare part of the warfare state. So I urge all of you, get active. We need to educate first ourselves, and then we need to educate the people around us. And I was hoping last year that we would take a little more active role in the tea parties, because I foresaw that they were going to grow to the extent that they did. Maybe not completely, but I felt that the time was ripe. When we met in December after the election, after having our candidate abused by the media for many, many months, lied about by Michelle Malkin and other people who claim to be these good conservatives. It proved that we were not beaten. We were defeated, but we weren't beaten. We were ready for another fight, and we need to take that fight out into the world. And none of this is included in my seminar here, but we'll try to catch up. I'm going to move real quick. But one big event that's coming up is the Wisconsin Patriot Coalition sponsored Tax Day Tea Party in Madison. Thrown together at the last minute, that brought out about 8,300 people last year. We're looking for at least 30,000. If there's any way that you can be there to let the people on the inside of the Capitol know that we are not happy with them, that we are looking for real change this time, I'd urge you to participate. And I'd also encourage you to do things. I mean, I'm doing right now an internet radio show, The Voice of Liberty on Revolution Broadcasting, rtrradio.com, 8 p.m. Monday through Friday. It's archived. I'm also a reporter for Reality News. They'll have a booth in the other room here pretty soon, I think, and that's sponsored by a fellow named Steve Welsenbach, who became a friend of mine in the last few months, and his partner, Bob Jewell. So, I'm doing as much as I can. I need help, but the good news is I've been at this almost 30 years, and there have been many, many times where I was the proverbial voice crying in the wilderness. And I'm happy to see that there are more people, both inside Campaign for Liberty and otherwise, that are aligned with our way of thinking, and I no longer feel quite so alone. And I'm extremely encouraged by all the people, some here and some at other places, that are under 30, that are going to be there to take up the battle when I get too old and too tired and too worn out to do it anymore. And that day is closer than I would like to think. Okay, let me fire up this PowerPoint. I hope this is a mouse. Okay. And, just click it and it'll go. All right. You can tell I'm not a computer geek. Sorry about that. But we're going to talk a little bit about money and banking. And before I get too deep into this, I want to thank Al Gore for helping me write this, and I think you'll be able to pick out the parts that he helped with. We're going to try to make it a little bit of fun anyway. The other thing is I spent most of my adult life, or about half of my adult life, swinging a hammer. You've heard of Joe the plumber. Meet Ken the carpenter. And I relate well to wood, and I think I can use these chunks of wood here to convey some ideas that I've learned over the last half of my lifetime. If this represents the value of the dollar in 1913, how much is today's dollar worth? Right there. Somebody said 4 cents. It's real close. And this seminar is about what happened between here, and hopefully a little bit of what we can do about it. So anyway, picking up the theme here, You know, there's a terrible thing that's happened to our country, so I want you to be afraid, be very afraid, as I bring you these inconvenient truths. Now we're going to start with a little bit of a quiz here. True or false, economic policy should be decided apolitically? Well, we would like to think that that is so, but you know, every action that a government takes either expresses or implies a political philosophy. You know, even a free market, that implies that, you know, you think we should leave the market to hell alone. And that's the closest thing you can be to an apolitical economy, is to be a free market. And this is indicated by the former term that the study of economics was known by, and that's political economy. What is the year that will live in infamy? I'm proud of you folks. And why is that? The Federal Reserve Act and the income tax and the 17th Amendment. God, I'm proud of this crowd. There's not many crowds where I could get that kind of an answer. Here's one for you eggheads out there. How big a money supply is enough? Okay. Well, the Keynesians would have you believe that all we need to do is keep printing money and all will be right with the world, but the Keynesians brought about the problem, the Keynesians and the monetarists, and they are closer in that respect, you know, in the creation of money. But Ludwig von Mises, who's my hero in the terms of economics, he said that any amount of money is enough so long as wages and prices are free to fluctuate with market conditions. And that's exactly why the Great Depression was so prolonged, is because we weren't free. They locked in wages and they did much to increase the costs of doing business, just as being done today. And that did nothing but prolong the Great Depression. And, okay, the current economy is caused by deregulation in the free market. Is there anybody here who believes that? If so, please leave. That's nonsense. But you got people like Bob Ignatius and E.J. Dionne from the Washington Post who keep putting this folly out, these absolute lies. Anybody with half a brain knows that it was things like the Community Reinvestment Act, where banks were forced to give loans that were of marginal value or worse, knowing full well that a lot of these in the long run would not be viable. Government-sponsored enterprises like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac bought up these bad notes and lied about their value to the market, sold these packages, and then you had the big investment banks buying up these packages of loans and selling derivatives based off of all of that, and they lied about the value of the bundle of loans that they purchased to back up these derivatives. So all along the way, you had, you know, the mechanisms of government interference, and you had basically fraud going on at every step of the way. You know, if they wanted to do something, if the government wanted to do something, they would prohibit fraud. And as far as George Bush, and the biggest fraud is the Federal Reserve, and I'm going to get to that. George Bush, it is said, deregulated the market. Well, that's not true at all. During the Bush years, there were some 80,000 pages added to the Federal Register in an average year, and that's a pretty good indication of the bureaucracy that's added on to that's already existing, as well as the laws that are passed. You know, Vince Lombardi, every year he said, gentlemen, we're going to start with the basics. This is a football, and I hope not to insult your intelligence, but I'm just going to go through a little bit about, you know, what my thoughts and some of the people that I study, their thoughts are on money. What is money? A medium of exchange, a store of value, a store of labor. It's been described as this, and, you know, if that's not precisely it, those are close enough for our purposes today. And why is money, if not necessary, it's a good thing to have? Why don't we just trade, you know, a horse for, you know, medical services, for example? You can see it is very inefficient. Using a medium of money, you know, if you have eggs or chickens to sell, you can sell them for money, take that money and buy any other consumer product you want. And if we're going to be on the barter system, it's going to slow the economy down, it's going to be very inefficient, and we won't enjoy the standard of living that we do using the indirect change medium of money. some things that have been used as money over the years: puka shells, tobacco, cigarettes. You can read. I won't go through reading the whole list since we're a little bit behind here, but each of these had a problem. Puka shells, well, the South Seas Islanders that were using them, excuse me, let me just, okay. Puka shells, the South Seas Islanders that were using them, somebody went to the other side of the island and found that there were unlimited supplies, so what did that do to the value of those puka shells? They kind of went down, right? Tobacco, well, you store tobacco for a while, it gets wet, it gets old, it oxidizes, it fails to hold its value. And the same with a lot of these others. You know, beaver pelts are great, but you know, if you don't have a whole beaver pelt, it's hard to make a blanket. You cut it into little ribbons, you know, if you want to buy just something small, you've destroyed a lot of the value. And these arguments might not be precise, but I hope you get the idea where I'm coming from here. What are the commodities that most often over time have been used as money?
Gold, silver.
And silver. And why is that?
Because they have value.
Okay, they have some intrinsic value. And I'm just going to read these off, and you can too. These are desirable characteristics of money. It has some intrinsic value in and of itself. It's widely recognized, not easily counterfeited, portable, divisible. You can chop that chunk of gold into smaller pieces, make smaller coins or silver. Not easily degraded, neither gold nor silver suffer from oxidation to the extent that iron does. If you made money out of iron, you'd have a pocket full of rust in a few months. And scarce, you know, the fact that they're scarce makes them more valuable. The law of supply and demand applies to money just as it does any other commodity. And what happens to fiat currency over time? Well, the great French philosopher Voltaire said, paper money eventually returns to its intrinsic value, which is zero. God, you people are alive this morning. I'm loving it. One of the most intelligent crowds I've ever spoken to. Amen. Okay, why is there a prohibition in the Constitution of making anything but gold and silver currency money? Okay, that's a good answer. Because during revolutionary times, we had what was called the Continental Dollar. And when the Continental Congress needed more dollars, what did they do? They printed them. And what did that do to the value? Went down. Until ultimately the phrase was, later on there was sound as a dollar, but in colonial times or near post-colonial times, it was not worth a continental. And what is counterfeiting? That's making money out of nothing. Inflation, what is that? Making money out of nothing. So the whole business of the Federal Reserve is counterfeiting. And deflation, specifically speaking and originally, inflation was meant to mean an expansion of the money supply. And this might sound like a semantic thing, but it's not. Because even if prices don't go up, there are some problems with expanding the money supply. And deflation is a contraction of the money supply. You know, when a note goes bad under our current fractional reserve system, money is erased from the economy. And I think in the 70s, was it the late 70s? No, late 80s. Late 80s, there was a downturn, and something like 25% of the coin of the realm disappeared because of the bad notes, which led to a contraction of the economy. Fractional reserve banking. Now, I'm sure a lot of you in here could give a better explanation than I can, but just in case there's somebody here who doesn't understand the mechanism, if I have $1,000 and put it in Citibank or whatever, they can only loan 900 of that to the next customer in the door. So let's say Todd comes in and he needs a loan of $900, they can give him that. And you would think that that would be the end of it, right? Well, it's not, because that $900 counts as if somebody else came in and put $900 into the bank, and therefore they can use the multiplier on that note, and 810 can be loaned against that 900. And the third generation, you have another guy coming in, he needs $729. We can give him that based upon the $810 note, based upon the 900, and so forth. I'm not going to get any deeper than that, but you multiply that all through, and essentially, $1,000 deposit can be turned into $10,000 in loans, expanding the money supply, making the value of the original deposit worth less. As if that wasn't bad enough, you have people like Hank Paulson over there. When he was CEO of Goldman Sachs, he could use leverage up to 40 to 1, 2.5 cents on the dollar or more. That means he could create into existence the money to buy the stock, to pay the commission to his broker, to skim off a little bit for his $100 million salary the last year he was there. And it's all counterfeit money. These bastards are rich because they're allowed to counterfeit money. Pardon my, no, don't pardon my anger. I mean every bit of that anger. Then on top of that, to make matters worse, the Federal Reserve has no reserve requirements. They can print money as needed to fill their coffers or do whatever they want, buy the assets of these banks. If a bank is loaned up, they can create money saying, you know, city, you're a good bank, here's some more, we'll put it in your account and you can loan against that, using that as your collateral to do your 10 to 1 multiplier. What are the effects of inflation? Well, the most common one we talk about is high prices, but that's not always so. We've got inflation going on right now, but still electronic goods are going down in price because of the greater productivity. And the same thing happened in the 1920s. Consumer goods didn't go up, they went down because of the investment in capital goods, yielded more productivity, more efficiency in the business world. So consumer prices went down, but it led to misallocation of resources. It led people to invest in businesses that could not be sustained. Malinvestments is what Mises and Hayek called them. You also have the potential for the crack-up boom, as in Weimar, Germany, and a few other places. I'm going to get back to that point. And then, you know, another effect you have of inflation or legalized counterfeiting through the fractional reserve banking system is that you have a concentration of wealth in the bankers, the people who get the money first. Say the real estate developers, they might get the money first while it's still valuable and before the prices have risen in that corner of the world. And then the last people who benefit from this inflation, I shouldn't say the last, but another significant group, is government and its favored special interests. And I'm going to talk more about this. Counterfeit money creates counterfeit businesses which can only be sustained by further debasing the currency. I believe that was Henry Hazlitt who said that. But it's the inflation that causes every bubble in our economy. Every single one. You know, whether the dot-com bubble, the stock bubble, the real estate bubble, all caused by inflation. A lot of people look back with fondness to the Clinton years, but they're not so good as it is perceived. First, you had people lying about their profit and losses in order to maintain their stock prices. But if there weren't the money out there to chase the stock prices, they wouldn't have had so much to worry about. You know, Tyco, World Crossing, Enron. And the tax collections were overstated also because of those false profits. And here's one, the accrual method of accounting. You know, under accrual, if I get a $50,000 down payment on a big house in December, that's not income until I offset it with the expenses of that house. You know, accrual merges expenses with income together, rather than, you know, having on a cash basis. If somebody gives me that down payment, I'd count it as income in the year received. And that's what our government is doing. You know, they're creating long-term liabilities, and they're not offsetting them with the income of today. So the best Clinton year, we had a $500 billion deficit on the accrual basis. And of course, Mr. Clinton wanted to spend a lot more than the Republicans allowed. Of course, the Republicans lost all principle when they gained power, but that's another story. And you know, just to show you what was going on, it was in the 90s during the Clinton administration. Mr. Greenspan said when the stock prices were, you know, the stock market Dow was at 6,300, he said this was due to irrational exuberance. And then he created enough money to drive the stock market to double that. And then when we opened the books and we saw all that red ink in January of 2001, must have been George Bush's fault because he hadn't even been in office yet, but he was elected. That's insane to think that, by the way, but that's the way some Democrats apparently think. But Mr. Greenspan in 2001 said, "We will create the liquidity with which to float the markets," papered over the economic problems, kicked the proverbial can down the road until we had a bigger crash in 2008, 2009. I'm going to skip that. I'm going to go through this a little bit quick here. What is the Federal Reserve Bank? It's a system of 12 regional banks. It's privately owned by member banks, but some of the positions are politically appointed, and it is both bank and regulator. Does anybody see a problem with the position of being both a bank and a regulator? Couldn't there be conflicts of interest? Or maybe a confluence of interest. You know, a lot of times these politicians, what's good for them is also good for the country. So maybe it's a confluence, not a conflict. Yes, I don't know if that's cynicism or realism, but we'll let that pass. Okay, who is behind the formation of the Federal Reserve? You can get the names in a number of different books, but they were representatives of the House of Rockefeller, the House of Morgan, and the Rothschild family, Kuhn-Loeb-Rohl, which is controlled by the Rothschild banking interests. These are the people in 1910, they met at Jekyll Island, formulated the plan, and about 3 years later, it came to pass. They created the Federal Reserve, got the Congress to pass that law. And what is the justification? Well, in 1907, there was a big bank panic, and that was because banks still used fractional reserve banking even though they didn't have the Federal Reserve. It was a lot more limited fractional reserve banking than was possible under a central banking system. But the justifications were to stabilize the economy and protect the value of the dollar. And they've been really, really successful because there's only been 17 economic downturns, including the Great Depression and the one of today. And we've lost some 94% or 96%. That's an error. That should be 96% of the value of our dollar. And the people who are in favor of government make the same claims today, despite this terrible, terrible record. More on the Fed. They created some $10 to $12 trillion since August of 2008. A lot of that money went to foreign banks and to the too big to fail banks. Both the Feds and the big banks had record profits in 2009 based upon that money that they created into existence. And one thing I want to point out is that, some people, if you hear this stuff from money masters, they get it half right. And they think that it's okay for the Congress to create currency, but inflation is inflation. The effects will be the same regardless of who creates it. But a lot of people point, oh, gee, the Federal Reserve is earning all that interest, but they actually give about 3/4 of that back to the Treasury. So that's not near as devastating. That 1/4 of the interest that they earn is not near as devastating as the effects of creating the money itself. Okay, the big banks also increased their market share last year. They were too big to fail, and but here's the kicker. Those toxic assets that TARP fund, 787, which was inflated to, I think it's $832 billion to buy up those toxic assets, they're still on the books over there, but they've been allowed to be revalued at or near par. So that says to me there's going to be another banking crisis sometime in our future. And Ben Bernanke refuses to tell us who benefited from his machinations behind the scenes there. HR 1207, Audit the Fence, Sunshine Bill. We're a little behind here, and I'm going to try to catch up, so hey, keep with the flow here. Government sacks, this is a headline from Huffington Post. Government sacks, Goldman's close ties to Washington arouse envy, raise questions. It just kind of calls attention to the opportunity that maybe there's a little conflict of interest between what's going on with these big banks, Treasury Department, Federal Reserve. And again, I'm going to try to catch up here, but Goldman Sachs is a political organization masquerading as an investment bank. They're sitting at the table with the top people in government, says Goldman critic Christopher Whalen, managing editor of Institutional Risk Analytics. And Goldman is the most political firm on Wall Street. I would concur with his criticism. This isn't the only, Huffington Post is not my favorite place to get my news, But if they're saying it and they're saying the same things that my favorite places are saying, that there's probably some validity to their arguments in this case. Here's a list of people that were in Treasury that have roots in Goldman. Chief among them, Hank Paulson, former Treasury Secretary. Bob Rubin, you know what he is? He's the top advisor for the Obama administration and has the distinction of being a former cabinet member, Treasury Department Secretary, former CEO of Goldman, former CEO of Citibank. Is there a little interlocking directorate going on here? Here's another list of people that are either associated with the Federal Reserve or Treasury, and there's another page I didn't print. And there's also one guy on there, the head of the Enforcement Division of Security and Exchange Commission. Guess what his job was right before that? Goldman Sachs. He was an upcoming star at Goldman Sachs. And the result of all of this, they have $14 billion in profits for 2009 after handing out $16 billion in bonuses, and every single penny of it came almost directly from the taxpayers through AIG. And if it didn't come from there, it did come from the inflation that was dumped into their accounts. It just shows you how rotten it is, right to the core. Effects of the Federal Reserve: boom-bust economy, falling dollar, concentration of wealth in the super rich. The poor and middle class are at a greater disadvantage, and it greatly increases the size and cost of government. Here's a graph I want to show you, or a pie chart I want to show you. That little line I showed you to the upper and left part of that, that's about what the Federal Reserve owns of that, $4,315. They own about 23% of the federal debt. And the banks, I think it's up around 10 or 12%, so you got the banking institutions owning somewhere between 35 and 40% of our federal debt. You know, maybe they think that the government's too big to fail, and they're afraid to say no. Excuse me. And then these figures are a little bit old. They're over a year old. I think Chinese are up over $1 trillion and the Japanese up over 700. But, you know, I think you're pretty well aware, if not of the specific numbers, of the nature of the problem. Okay, I want to call your attention to the graph upper left, and this is delinquency rate on single-family residential mortgages. Okay. Anyway, does that remind you of anything? Does that remind you of anything?
Global warming.
Only this graph is for real.
Yeah.
2008 is where this drops off. It actually leveled off in 2009 a little bit, but there's people that are using up their assets to pay their mortgages, their 401ks, their jobs are going away, their unemployment is drying up. Expect that to go back up. You know, they don't show 2009 here, but that flattened out, but that is going to go up. Here's another interesting one, and does this one remind you of anything over here? This is non-borrowed reserves of depository institutions. You know, when the notes started going bad, their reserves started drying up, they couldn't loan. This is before the Fed dumped in trillions of dollars. See, the banks don't have anything to lend without that money that the Fed stuck in there. But all that, you know, if you have money in your account, that makes your dollars worth less because they're creating more dollars to compete with yours. Here is monetary base, and the monetary base is that money that flows in the economy. You know, you take it to the store, this and that. And again, it takes off in just a month or so's time. It almost double. It goes up by, yeah, almost double. Went from 800 to like 1.5 trillion dollars that the Fed just about doubled the currency circulating. And the effects of that. Here's a guy who works for the Federal Reserve, and Robert G. Anderson explains the monetary base, and down here he says in the bold part, so long as the public is willingly holds additional base money, the central bank is able to purchase assets and expand its size. Historically, this has tempted governments with weak fiscal discipline to utilize the central bank as purchaser of last resort for government debt. when private capital markets are unreceptive, often leading to hyperinflation. This guy works for the Federal Reserve in St. Louis, by the way. I don't think that's the company line. How do I go back? I'll get you that information afterwards, okay? Excuse me. Here's another one, public debt, and it doesn't have the last, it doesn't have 2009 on there. That's another 1.5. You can see it's going up. This bottom graph here, I don't like that one real well because it goes as a percent of GDP. But what's ignored there, if they put in the unfunded liabilities, we'd have a more classic, I mean, we're accumulating unfunded liabilities like they're water. That graph would be a lot different. And some people have used that bottom graph to justify more spending because, hey, look, back in 1950, we had 80% of GDP. That's nonsense. You know, we're already at 80 or 85% of GDP with the 2009 figure thrown in there. And 2010, I'll bring it up to 100% of GDP. With the other unfunded liabilities, we don't have the opportunity. I'm going to blow by this one here because we're going to catch up. Now, I'm going to give this little piece here from here to the end is pretty much the same speech I've given to about 10 different times, mostly to bodies of government on why they should economize. And in order to help me explain this, I've thrown out a few numbers. And it's quite obvious that numbers in and of themselves are pretty worthless without an explanation of what they mean. $12.7, that's trillion dollars, that's the official federal debt. $40,000, that's your share per man, woman, and child, roughly speaking, round numbers. 107. Some economists think that that's what our unfunded liabilities amount to, a debt of $1.107 trillion. And I just read the other day that the people in charge of your Social Security money, that's what they think just for them. That's the unfunded liabilities without the FDIC and you know, taking care of broken veterans and all of that thrown in. So your share of that 107 of unfunded liabilities, $333,000. And zero, this is the amount of money we have against those unfunded liabilities. Yeah. The account is filled with pieces of paper, IOUs. Okay. This got reformatted on me. It's a little confusing because it's not the way I put it up because I had to switch the program here, so I apologize for this delay here. There should be a 17 up here, which is the approximate percentage of the economy that our healthcare is. And they're in the process of taking it over. They're going to lie to us and say, no, no, we're not. This, you know, they're going to tell us all kinds of things that are not true. And right now, we're paying about half of the 17. By one level of government or another is paying half of what the healthcare cost is right now. That leaves half of that we have yet to shift over to government, and with the bureaucracy they've added, it's going to go up to at least 10% of our GDP. So that's this 10 here. 61% is the actual cost of government. That includes income tax, sales tax, licenses, fees, permits, state, federal, local, all thrown in, plus what you pay your accountant and what you pay to other businesses in order to comply with all the rules and regulations imposed upon us as individuals and businesses. 61%. 36, David M. Walker, former Comptroller General of the United States of America, has been saying for years, he's been on this fiscal reality tour, and only a few of us have been listening. But back when our cost of government was around 50%, he was saying that 36% of that was what we actually pay in taxes, and that in order to pay this number up here, which was a lot lower then, we'd have to double the tax rate. 67, 36, 97 is the total. That's the total percent of GDP if you just go on these outdated assumptions. Plus the 10 over there, 107% of GDP is going to be the real cost of government if we keep on going the way we are. How's that going to work out? $1.4 trillion. That was our deficit last year, a record, almost 4 times what it was before that. 1.6, the projected trillion-dollar deficit for the current year, or the year that they're planning. $3 trillion under the Obama administration has been added or will be soon to the federal debt. And this is just the nominal debt, not the real unfunded liability debt. 3 is also the size of the budget, $3 trillion that is, under the last year of the Bush administration. So in just a little over 2 years, oh, the other thing is it's 3.3, I didn't have that number on there, but that's the amount of debt added under the Bush administration. Mr. Obama's on track to equal 8 years of Bush debts in just a little over 2. That 0 over there, that's the chance that all of this is going to come together for the good of us in this room and the rest of America. But, you know, the federal debt will be paid. I guarantee you that. But it's going to be paid with paper currency or electronic blips. And in Weimar, Germany, you know, there's pictures of people with wheelbarrows taking Deutschmarks and throwing them into the furnace. I've yet to figure out how to burn an electronic blip, which is how most of our money exists today. So anyway, bailout, stimulus, government interference is the problem. It's not the solution. And it's been given to us under both Democrat and Republican regimes. This interference in the economy has helped the politically favored, but at the expense of the rest of us. And, you know, these bailouts are not likely to save the most distressed businesses. Government owners will go bankrupt. I don't care how many trillions of dollars they give them. So we're taking the wealth of the people who are productive, are earning something, and giving it to non-productive, counterproductive businesses and to government. And as I showed you in the previous graph, a lot of that money is coming not from the taxpayer, but from the Federal Reserve, which in effect is from the taxpayer because it makes your dollars worth less. And we're seeing right now, as the government's getting bigger, a breakdown in the rule of law, the lack of respect for the Constitution. Bonds are going to be harder to sell if you are trying to accumulate capital to create jobs. And I predict a longer and deeper recession and more unemployment. But there's a tiny glimmer of good news here because there's several $100 billion that Mr. Obama wants to dump into the economy to fuel it up just in time for the election so that the ignoramuses out there will pull the lever for him and his henchmen again. Don't be fooled. They're buying it at the expense of our future prosperity. So anyway, I'm very fearful that we're reaching a tipping point on our, oh, this is going the wrong way. This is reformatted. That's supposed to slant the other way. It's supposed to slant like this to race to the bottom. But I have a surefire stimulus plan here. Reduce the size of the government and end the Federal Reserve. If we cut the size of government in half, we will essentially be doubling your take-home pay or reducing the price of goods and services. Do you think that might stimulate the economy if we all had a little more money to spend, to save, to invest? So my proposal is to leave more wealth in the hands of the people, allow more competition to create the productive economy, and I predict more freedom, more wealth, and happiness if we have the courage to follow this path. You know, for years they've been saying, oh, your cracked up ideas don't work, this libertarianism or fiscal conservatism, but I think the shoe's on the other foot. You know, we've been saying, you know, what's going to happen. You've got none of the people in the Bush administration, they were all surprised by this. You know, everybody, you know, almost everybody in the Keynesian camp, they were surprised by this economic downturn. They poked fun at Peter Schiff and Ron Paul and Tom Woods and Robert Murphy over at Cato and a bunch of people like that. But this is the only hope we have, and you know it's a good hope because what we propose is by and large what made America great, and it's up to us to make sure that we make America great again. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope you